Hello, I imagine this is probably going to be the last regular Franklin Expedition video. If you want to know more, there's a small army of books and documentaries out there. Not to say I won't come back to it though, I'm thinking about doing a video about a book called The Franklin Conspiracy, which is Infowars.com for Franklin stuff. In this video I'm going to use footage from several different documentaries, including Passage, a fascinating docudrama about Dr. John Ray, the first Franklin searcher. But it touches on just about everything. This video is mainly going to be about the interaction between the crews and the Inuit, but I'm going to start off with the Londonderry Vision because when my hometown gets name dropped in connection to the Franklin expedition, I'm going to talk about it. Years after the ships were trapped in the ice, when word hadn't been received and people were getting desperate, all manner of spiritualists and psychics tried to use the Franklin expedition to make a name for themselves. This was the most successful. William Coppin was a Northern Irish merchant captain. His youngest daughter had recently died. Her siblings reported seeing lights, and in the lights they saw images and began making predictions. Naturally, people eventually started asking the lights what had happened to the Erebus and Terror. Remember, the Franklin expedition was still massive news at this point. The children saw images of the words Sir John Franklin, Lancaster Sound, Point Victory and more. Most of these being places where they later found out the expedition had been. According to some reports, some of the early discoveries by searchers were found after they'd been ordered to check areas seen in the vision. Do I think it's real? No, there were dozens, if not more, psychics and spiritualists bothering Lady Jane Franklin, and this was just the most accurate of them. And let's be honest here, it pales in comparison to Dr. Richard King. When the crews left the ships to march south, the cutlery was handed out to the men. You see, on board ship, the officers used silver cutlery that they paid for themselves. This was usually monogrammed. It was a status symbol. Common crewmen, though, had no need for knives with proper cutting edges as they ate heavily boiled food from cans or ship's biscuit. But on the road, especially if you're going to try and hunt and forage, you need proper cutting edges, so the officers' monogrammed cutlery was handed out. As a result of this, we know exactly who originally owned most of the cutlery that was found by the Inuit and later traded back to the searchers. It can't be overstated how weird the events of the Franklin expedition must have been for the local Inuit. The British, technically I suppose, owned the Canadian Arctic at the time, but visits from the white men were few and far between. It wasn't like colonization further south. Inuit could live a whole life and never meet any white people, or kablunas as they called them. Apparently the Inuit had trouble getting their minds around the kablunas. They had amazing material wealth, remember metal and even wood were precious in the Arctic, but they didn't understand the basics of how to live in the cold. Inuit bands tended to be small, and here was what appeared to be an army of these strange people dragging boats from the middle of nowhere, leaving equipment and dead as they marched. Now, the only reference I found to this is the Franklin expedition door at Bom-Banes cafe in Brighton, so take this with a mountain of salt. But apparently one of the conclusions they came to about the kablunas was that they were the offspring of disobedient girls and dogs. I don't know if the girls were supposed to be disobedient in general, or if they were told not to screw dogs in particular. If anyone has any extra information about whether this was a real belief or a myth, please leave a comment. Inuit beliefs about bestiality is not the easiest thing to find a book about. Anyway, apparently the earliest known meeting between the Inuit and the crews came after they abandoned the ships. There are many accounts of meetings, mainly collected in the years afterwards by the earliest Franklin searchers such as Charles Francis Hall and Leopold McClintock. Other stories were told second or even third hand and based on oral tradition, so I'm not even going to try and tell you the accounts in chronological order. There's no way to be sure. Back in the second video I talked about Aglica, the leader of the last band of men travelling south, and the idea that he was Crozier. Well, here's much more detail. One of the stories featured the Inuit camping near the ships and being visited by the leader of the kablunas, and the second, who was identified as Aglica. The leader was older, grey-haired, wore glasses, had a round face, was friendly to everyone and very cheerful, while Aglica was a more distant figure. This sounds like Franklin and Crozier, but the Inuit weren't supposed to know about the ships until after Franklin had died and the ships had been abandoned. The Inuit tended to avoid the north of King William Island because of a lack of hunting. But the descriptions of the leader and Aglica fit Franklin and Crozier, and none of the other explorers of the era. And the man who told the story even owned some of the officers' silverware from the expedition. Even the things that are accepted as basically probably facts about the Franklin expedition sometimes don't line up. Maybe the Inuit went unusually far north and found the ships. Maybe the story's not about Franklin and Crozier. Maybe both. Anyway, the Inuit also described something that sounds like a funeral of an important officer. A line of men taking a body inland from the ships, a gun salute and the body being covered in what sounds like cement. Often this was suggested to be Franklin's funeral, but, like I said, the Inuit apparently didn't know about the ships until long after his death. So I don't know, and no one else does. Honestly, I think the funeral happened after the ships were moved and it wasn't Franklin's but Crozier's, Fitzjames or another high-ranking officers. If it was Crozier, then that maybe can't have been Anglica for most of the stories because those apparently happened later on. There was a meeting that happened between a small group of crewmen led by Anglica and an Inuit band on the southeast side of King William Island. The Kablunas traded a knife for some seal meat and cooked the meat using some blubber, a mistake as blubber is high in calories. The story tells how Anglica would write notes in a book and try to explain what happened to the ships via mime and gestures, which wouldn't have been necessary if it was Crozier, as he spoke the language better than any of the officers. That meeting didn't end well, as the Inuit left in the morning while the crewmen scrambled after them, screaming for help. Hearing that story basically destroyed Searcher Charles Francis Hall's faith in the Inuit. He felt they had let the crewmen die. And it seems that they did, but life in the Arctic was and is still hard. They couldn't afford to feed those strangers, they could barely feed their own people. There's a reason Inuit bands tended to be on the small side compared to the size of the crews. One of the last tales of Anglica, though it seems unlikely that this is the same guy, is about a group of 4 crewmen meeting the Inuit on the journey south. Anglica was the leader and an excellent hunter, but he was sick because unlike his men he refused to eat human flesh. And when I say sick, I mainly mean starving. They were able to stay with the band for the season and Anglica was nursed back to health. The crewmen left, heading for Fort Churchill, and never arrived. The Inuit who told the story thought they may have been killed by subarctic First Nations along the way. Remember, with the Franklin expedition, there's a mountain of maybes and possiblies and only a molehill of definite fact. Who was Anglica? No one knows, but he was probably more than one man. One of the stories that helped crystallize the legend that Crozier made it to near the end was some men wintering with a small band, and when the weather improved, the crewman's leader gave them a present of a sword. The sword was later traded to the Hudson Bay Company, and this is it. Now, the Inuit were asked about these events years after they happened, and through interpreters and memory with all its faults, it was eventually decided that the great officer who gave the sword was called Crow-Zar. But Dave Woodman, who rediscovered the Irving grave that I talked about in part 2, has come up with a pretty likely theory. You see, the sword does not belong to a naval officer. It's a marine sword. A marine sword that was given out in the reign of King William IV. That doesn't mean that Crozier wasn't using it, but there was a Royal Marine with the right rank to have a sword, who had received his sword in the reign of King William IV, Marine Sergeant Solomon Tozer. Personally, I feel that's about as much of an open-shut case as anything to do with the Franklin expedition. There are also tales that don't include reference to Anglica, such as a report of a camp on Crown Prince Frederick Island, an island so unimportant that it wasn't even added to the maps until the 1920s. I say it's a report of a camp because it's never been checked, not in the 150 years since it was first mentioned. Arctic archaeology is expensive, difficult, extremely limited because of the weather, and an isolated camp on a tiny rock doesn't have the lure of the ships, or the great undiscovered Franklin prize, Franklin's grave. Plus, Crown Prince Frederick Island is a long way from King William Island. To this day, getting there is impractical, much worse 150 years ago, back when any evidence was fresh. Plus, the island's large, just finding a camp would be very difficult. If survivors were there, I can only guess that the men got tired of dragging a lifeboat and made a desperate attempt to sail to safety. And just so you know, these images are not of Crown Prince Frederick Island. It's so unimportant that I couldn't even find any pictures of it. The Inuit told the earliest searchers that they had found a group of roughly 40 men who had starved to death near the mouth of Backsfish River, the river they were heading for. It's possible that the large collection of men were the weakest, left behind to wait for aid that never came. That some men had attempted to sail down the river either in a lifeboat that they dragged or in an early inflatable boat. Obviously, no trace of them have ever been found. Backsfish River is apparently very difficult to sail at the best of times. There were other camps filled with corpses, including one at Terror Bay, a short distance where the HMS Terror was found. A collection of tents filled with half-eaten corpses, gnawed at by animals and pieces removed by saws. Skulls with holes drilled in them, possibly another place for the sick and injured to await rescue, or possibly something darker. Remember the tale of the black men I mentioned back in the first and second videos? There's a second part to it. After the officer rescued the Inuit, he took him up to the deck and pointed to tents in the distance, and told him not to go there, not to let any of his people go there, that the men who live there will harm them. There was evidence of cannibalism and long, drawn-out, slow deaths at the Terror Bay camp. While metal and wood were precious in the Arctic, books were not. The Inuit found a large collection of books and papers that the crews had stored on the march south. Not understanding the significance, they cast them to the winds. The consensus is they were probably some records or logbooks, but I hope they're wrong about that. Remember, when it comes to the Franklin expedition, consensus can change wildly over time as more information comes to light. Now, let me end with some information pertaining to the Terror. The villain of the book and show, apart from the giant demon bear, is one Cornelius Hickey. In the book, and probably the show, he's a manipulative, cruel psychopath with a god complex. But what about real life? Short answer is we don't know. Hickey wasn't an officer, so all we have is his name, age, and where in Ireland he was born. How'd he end up the villain? Probably a mixture of his name and the fact that they found a knife belonging to him at Starvation Cove, the area near the river where so many men starved. Yes, I'm back to the cutlery. The thing that makes a knife memorable is that it didn't start out as a knife, but as a medical scalpel. A medical bag was abandoned early in the march, so that's probably where it was from. Why am I mentioning this? Just so you keep in mind while watching The Terror that most of the characters are nothing like the men who inspired them, because we don't know anything about the men who inspired them. And on some level, I feel it's pretty cruel that this poor man, who died such a horrible and drawn-out death, will go down in history as a monster thanks to the book and show. Franklin, Crozier, and all are known figures. They have Wikipedia articles and books. Poor Hickey only has the Terror, a knife, and a few words in a record book listing his date and place of birth. He was from Limerick, and was 24 when the expedition sailed. The Terror is apparently airing in April 2018, and I hope you all watch it. I'm looking forward to it. I have other ideas for history videos, starting out with the race for the poles if you're interested.